For this week, we are looking at Chapter 14 in Louis Vaughn's Doing Ethics, and the topic is racism, equality, and discrimination. What we're going to be doing in this lecture is we are going to be looking at the concepts of race and racism, and we're going to consider how those ideas have led to disparities between different groups of people, and then that will lead into a moral question about the topic of affirmative action. So we'll be considering the pros and cons, the moral pros and cons between whether or not affirmative action policies are good for society and whether or not those policies are necessary to eliminate some of the disparities that exist between different groups of people. And so that's where we're going in this chapter. As always, I'll say make sure that you read the chapter in its entirety because I'm not going to be able to cover everything that's in Chapter 14. So you'll want to read the chapter before you take your quiz. So let's begin with the question of race and racism. So what is race? What is racism? Well, your textbook describes the core idea of race as being a relatively new notion where you have distinct groups of people who share distinct biological and or cultural traits. Now, your textbook argues, I think rightly, that the notion of race as being a biological reality is actually a myth, which means that races in an objective sense don't actually exist. And yet, many people believe that they do exist. And in fact, throughout the United States, throughout the history of the United States, people have believed and unfortunately still believe that there are these different races, whether you define them as whites or blacks or people of color, but people perceive that there are different racial groups. And because of that perception, even though it doesn't exist as a biological objective reality, it means something culturally. And so you might say that this chapter is arguing that having a colorblind attitude is not something that is helpful when talking about race because people do see color, and because of the belief that our culture has had in the differences between the races, race is still a concept that we need to talk about, especially if we're going to be talking about issues of justice and issues of distributive justice. And so the concept of race that we have as a culture leads into questions about racism. So what exactly is racism? Well, again, your textbook gives a definition. Racism is simply the belief that not only that distinct races do exist, but that some races are inferior in some respects or otherwise deserving of dislike or hostility. And there are two concepts of racism that fall under this definition, and we can get at those concepts by asking a couple questions. So do you ever feel that another group of people are inferior to you or to the group that you're a part of? Those types of feelings would be racist feelings. Or do you feel antipathy? So this would be a dislike towards a certain group of people. Well, that would be a racist feeling, a racist emotion. And so racism in a strict sense is just thinking that there are some races that are inferior in some respect to another group. And this could play out in whether you feel inferior or antipathy towards different groups. There are terms related to racism that are important to consider. So you have racial prejudice. So this is the bias that we have, the bias opinions that we have based upon incomplete or erroneous data. So this might happen when sometimes people will have an experience with somebody from a different race or a different culture, and that one experience colors the way that they look at the entire group. Well, when that happens, that's racial prejudice. There's also racial discrimination, which is just unfavorable treatment towards people because of their race. And then there's also a distinction between individual racism and institutional or structural racism. And these differences are important to talk about. So most people, when they think about racism, they're thinking only in terms of individual racism. And so this is the person-to-person acts of intolerance or discrimination that happens at an interpersonal level. Well, individual racism oftentimes plays out at the level of emotions. So people feel dislike towards another group of people, or they feel like some groups of people are inferior. And you can feel the individual racism when, on the other hand, when it comes to institutional or structural racism, you might not feel the racism in the same way. And so the structural racism is the unequal treatment that arises from the way that organizations, institutions, or social systems are set up. So sometimes this is also called systemic racism. This is racism without racists. And what that means is you can have a system that is a racist system. So the system as a whole is racist, even though individuals within that system don't feel as though they are being racist. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about institutional or structural racism. And so when we look at the issue of affirmative action, we're really focusing on this last category. So are there systems that are sometimes put in place that cause there to be unequal treatment between different groups of people? And in the history in the United States, there have obviously been cases where that has been the case, and that has led to current disparities. And the topic of affirmative action is trying to figure out, are there ways to alleviate some of the past injustices that have happened because of racial discrimination? And so this leads us back into a discussion that we had in our last lecture when we were looking at the philosopher John Rawls and his egalitarian approach to distributive justice. Now, in the last lecture, we applied Rawls' theory to the issue of healthcare and distributing healthcare. For this lecture, I want to use it to talk about affirmative action. So affirmative action starts with this idea that different groups of people have been treated differently. And so if you compare the race of life to just a typical race where you have people competing on a track, some people on the track of life have had a moving walkway. And life has been very easy for them, so that if you just walk down the walkway, or you don't do anything at all, the chances are pretty good that you're going to be successful in life. Other people have not had a moving walkway, but they've still had to do effort to achieve something. And still other people have had severe obstacles in their way as they've been running the race of life. Now, how this relates to racial disparities is, if you look at any society, and for us, we're looking at the United States, if we ask the question, have different groups, racial groups, been treated differently when it comes to the race of life? Have different groups had different obstacles put in their way that have hindered their ability to achieve success? And the answer to that question seems certainly yes. The history of the United States has been one where there has been severe disadvantages for people of color, and there have been advantages as a result for people who are white. And so Rawls' egalitarian theory of distributive justice relates to this issue by asking, are there policies that we can put in place that would help alleviate some of those disparities? And affirmative action is one of those policies that we might consider when we think about alleviating some of the disparities. So let's start with a basic definition of affirmative action. So affirmative action is a policy where you try to make amends for or eradicate discrimination based upon race, ethnicity, and gender. And so in many ways, you're seeking to overcome structural racism that exists. And that's how we're going to be applying affirmative action in this lecture. Now, there are weak forms of affirmative action, and there are strong forms of affirmative action. A weak form of affirmative action is where you're simply trying to end current discriminatory practices. So this would be if you notice that there are policies that are already in place that are causing disparities between different racial groups, then weak affirmative action says justice requires that we would end those discriminatory practices. And then if you hold to a weak form of affirmative action, once you've ended those practices, then affirmative action is done. That's weak affirmative action. Strong affirmative action says that we have to go beyond weak affirmative action and says that we actually have to use policies and procedures to favor particular individuals because of their race, gender, or ethnic background. Now, this idea actually supports preferential treatment on the basis of race or gender or ethnic background, but it does so to compensate for past discrimination. So strong affirmative action says, okay, even if you remove the various obstacles in the way for people running the race of life, because of past discrimination, because of past obstacles, some people will be lapsed behind other people based upon past injustices. And so strong affirmative action says we need to compensate for that. And so we can start by looking at different arguments for this strong affirmative action so we can understand why some people hold to this idea. So again, strong affirmative action says that we want to put procedures in place that do give preferential treatments to some people on the basis of race, but the purpose of it is to compensate for past wrongs. That's what strong affirmative action is arguing for. And I want to look at this specifically within the context of education. Sometimes when we're talking about these policies, it's good to be specific so we know where these types of policies might be enacted. So when it comes to the notion of equality, if you look at, so we've already used the analogy of running the race, but there's this popular meme out there that compares the idea of equality with the idea of equity. So maybe you've seen this meme floating around. Well, equality says that everyone should get the same size box so that you can watch the baseball game. Well, you see in the picture under equality there that not everyone has the same ability, the same height to watch the game, and so the box doesn't do the same thing for everyone. Where equity will give the tall person, I mean, he doesn't have to have the box there, so he can watch the game without the box, but the short person needs two boxes so that he can watch the game. And then equity says, because you distribute justice in this way, everyone has a chance to watch the game. And so this is related to the race of life analogy, where when you look at the differences between different cultures when it comes to their successes or failures, it's not merely the result of competing moral values. It's not just because some people worked hard and other people didn't work hard, but there really are disparities that exist on the basis of either past injustices or on the basis of factors that people can't actually control in the present. And so strong affirmative actions, arguments for strong affirmative actions say that we want to create as much equity as we can, and one way to do that is to compensate for past wrongs, which would be to allow people to come up further in the race if they have been disadvantaged in the past. There are other arguments for strong affirmative action. So there's the idea of promoting diversity. And so this argument for affirmative action would say that diversity brings value to the entire educational experience. So if we only allowed one group of people into, say, a university, well, that would disadvantage all the students that are going there, because they don't get to meet people from different backgrounds, whether it's socioeconomic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds. And so diversity actually brings additional value to the educational experience. And it may also lead to social equity in the future by having diversity. And so some argue that just the idea of diversity is a goal that educators should consider when it comes to accepting people into the university system. A third argument is the idea of correcting for educational backgrounds. So when it comes to, say, reading ACT scores, one should factor in that different racial groups, by and large, might come from different educational backgrounds. And so if you want to properly read the ACT score, you have to take into account the different backgrounds that people are coming from. And so if you come from a disadvantaged educational background, you might be just as intelligent as somebody who was admitted to a university, but because that person had a better educational background, went to a better school that had more advantages at that school, that person might have been allowed into a university because of their ACT score, where you weren't allowed in because you came from a disadvantaged educational background. And so this idea of correcting for educational background says when we read the relevant scores for admittance to a university, whether it's ACT, the GPA, we have to factor in that the different backgrounds that people come from to read the scores correctly. And so these are three arguments that are often given in support of strong affirmative action: compensating for past wrongs, promoting diversity, and correcting for educational backgrounds. Now, there is an argument opposing strong affirmative action that is worth considering here before we end this lecture, and that is the critique that strong affirmative action policies actually promote a form of reverse discrimination. Now, those who complain about strong affirmative action policies will say that this promotes unequal preferential treatment against some people, mostly white males, to advance the interests of others, whether it's minorities, women, and so sometimes people will object to that. And the main charge is that preferential treatment on the basis of race, gender, or minority status is always wrong. And so that is the main principle that those who are arguing that this is a form of reverse discrimination will put forward. Now, when you look at the different arguments for and against affirmative action, one of the things that it's important to consider, and this is where I'll say make sure that you read your textbook to get some of the moral principles and how the different moral principles relate to affirmative action and disparities that exist because of race. But one of the things that comes up in this discussion is whatever moral principle that you're starting with will probably influence the way that you think about affirmative action. So if you are arguing on the basis of John Rawls' egalitarian principle, then you probably will be a supporter of strong affirmative action. Because remember, Rawls is arguing that behind the veil of ignorance, we want to figure out how do we create a society that is just for all people, and especially for people who are disadvantaged in that society. Now, on the other hand, a libertarian might have an entirely different perspective on this because, again, they're arguing for a principle of liberty. And so a libertarian might say that we want to just treat people equally in the sense of we don't want to use any government policy to prefer one group over another group. And so a libertarian might be very sympathetic to this idea of reverse discrimination. But again, read your chapter, look at how the different moral theories relates to the arguments for and against affirmative action, and then after you read the chapter, you can take your quiz.